Spokane listens when business talks. Welcome to Business Talks, the region's only local business talk show with your host, Ryan McNeice. Business Talks is brought to you by our friends at STCU and Well Dressed Walrus. Now, let's get down to business with Business Talks.
Welcome to Business Talks. I'm Ryan McNeice, and we're here in the studio with author Warren Reiner of the Bel Air Man. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Ryan.
Warren, I think as a general theme for Business Talks, I'm always interested in talking to individuals that, whether it be traditional business, nonprofits, etc., I'm interested in the trajectory of why people do what they do, how they've come from A to Z. And your story is an interesting one. This is your first book.
My first published book, yes.
But I'm going to pick that apart. First published book, but you have been telling stories within the family and writing stories down for quite a while. However, you've been flying all over the world in a different occupation.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about your occupation for several decades.
So primarily in high-tech sales. Actually, most recently retired from Seattle area to Spokane. Worked for a company there called Intermec, who specialized in barcode decoding software and hardware, and I ran the OEM division for that company. But previous to that, I had actually worked at Keytronic here in Spokane back in their early keyboard days.
Very popular name in the early days.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So that was a great career jump too there. So with Intermec, I was there about 16 years, ran that division, did a lot of world travel, sold to OEM customers, meaning manufacturers of primary equipment, so customers such as Panasonic and IBM and those people who integrated our products into theirs.
So a lot of time spent on airplanes probably writing actual contracts, purchases and sales, orders, etc. A little bit different type of writing.
A lot of business plans, marketing things, did a lot of product positioning papers. We had a customer newsletter that we did to our global customers to update them on technologies and new things and hopefully entice them to buy the next great thing from us, right?
Right, that was your job.
That was my job. So a lot of writing in that capacity, and I enjoyed it. It was part of the job I liked. I've always liked to write. I actually had a little newspaper when I was about 8 years old.
Okay, I didn't know.
Called the Reiner Review, actually.
There you go.
And wrote little silly articles about things and what we did on the playground and things like that. So we had that. And I wrote short stories. Actually ran across one about 6 months ago when my wife and I were moving that I'd written when I was probably about 9 or 10. And it was awful, but
did she tell you that? Or?
No, it was my own analysis. But it was interesting that I didn't even remember writing it. But here was the story I'd written. It was a horror actually story, so it's kind of silly. But
so what with the Bel Air Man, and I personally have had an opportunity to read it, and I think it's really good. What was the maybe the impetus or the origin, whether it be on one of these flights? Were there early renditions of this, parts of this that then you picked up later, or did you sit down, knock this whole thing out?
So it sort of had two parts.
Okay.
I actually remember I started writing it on a flight to Germany. We were flying into Frankfurt for some meetings over there, and it's funny. I didn't really have a template that you would normally have for a story, like a lot of authors, like James Patterson. He's
maybe
famous.
To fit the trajectory of storyline.
Has a big outline when he starts. I just started writing without intent of really even publishing. And so I'm writing away, and it's like a 12-hour flight. And you can actually get quite a bit done in 12 hours of typing.
Yeah, captive audience, right?
And most of the people were sleeping or had a couple extra glasses of wine or whatever, or watching a movie, and the flight attendants came by and says, "What are you working on so feverishly?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book." She goes, "You're kidding me. Are you an author?" I go, "Well, I am now."
In that direction,
right?
Yeah.
So she says, "Well, I really want a copy when you're done," which I just thought was really strange because she had no idea what I was writing about, just the fact that it was someone writing a book. So I decided to keep going.
And what year was that, did you say? Ish?
Ish. Probably about 4 years ago.
About 4 years ago.
Yeah, I would guess about 4 years ago. And then as I continued to work on it on airplanes and rewrite parts of it as I went along, I actually had a fairly serious heart attack in 2015.
Oh, okay, so recently.
And so I was out of commission, and I had to go through some recuperation, and that was just therapy for me.
Some more writing time.
Yeah, I couldn't work, so I was at home and couldn't do anything because I had to recuperate physically. And so that's when I finished the book.
And had you retired at that particular time officially?
No, I was still working.
Still
Actually,
working?
I was in Houston when I had the heart attack on business. Yeah. So during the recuperation, I thought, well, I'm going to finish this. So I just plowed ahead.
While writing, let's even go back to that visual on the airplane, that you're writing this book, you're diving in passionately. What was your thought process as a business person, or was this the thought process? How am I going to publish this? How am I going to get this work that I'm passionate about? How am I going to get this to market? Was that a thought process, or at the point where you're just passionately trying to get a story down on paper?
Well, in hindsight, I was very naive about the whole publishing.
Ignorance is bliss sometimes.
I probably would have given up.
Myself.
Right? But I assumed I'd have to go through a literary agent process and all that at the time.
More traditional.
More traditional. I really didn't give the publishing part a great deal of thought at the point. I was just into the story and wanted to write it, and if it published, it published.
Right.
And that was
secondary.
Yeah.
No, I think it makes sense. So then what? Once you realized maybe you weren't going to go that route,
right.
What steps did you take?
So I probably read at least 6 or 7 books on publishing to try and understand it. And really the traditional route, there's sort of trade-off. The traditional route with the literary agent is long and painful and maybe not fruitful because you may not get picked up.
Well, I was going to say, what I've read statistically behind the scenes, it's unbelievable how many books are written, if you will, but what is actually published through a traditional method or sells is few and far between. And
it's gotten so with the literary agents, and what I understand from my own research, is that you almost have to write the book for sale. So you have to
gear it towards
form your story around what someone would buy. Which really wasn't what I did. So that's a long process, and I decided that I probably had more money than time, which is the difference when you go self-publish because you're paying for everything.
Absolutely.
So I decided that. So then I bought 3 or 4 more books and studied all the self-publishing things, which is a whole nother minefield. But I finally zeroed in on a company, and actually a website that did a pretty good review of the different companies so that you stayed away from, let's say, the less scrupulous companies. Because there were some
pitfalls potentially
in the business. And so I settled on a company, did a contract with them, and we went through the whole editing process. They did the artwork for the cover.
Okay, so they're a bit all-inclusive in terms of assisting with the process.
Right, so they do the ISBNs, they do the Library of Congress, they do all that for you, which I didn't want to deal with. I wanted to pay somebody to do that.
And who is that company? Is that
Mill City Press was the publisher, and they're out of Florida. So they did a good job. I really had very few issues. I had a few issues with the cover artwork. A little bit of a funny story.
Yeah, give us a little more on that, because do you give them a little, I mean, clearly you're wanting to symbolize the story, if you will, through the cover. Tell us how that came to be.
So their first draft I got the first draft of the front cover, and it's Bel Air Man, which in the story represents a 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air, which is the heart's desire of the protagonist in the story.
Yeah, and most everyone else.
Right. And so I got the first draft back, and it had a pickup truck instead of a Chevy.
You're like, that's not a Bel Air.
Yeah, that's not, what are you doing? So I called the gentleman, and so he gets us on a conference call with the young lady who did the work, and she was maybe in her 20s. She had no idea what a Chevy Bel Air was.
Yeah. Chevy truck, Chevy Bel Air,
so once we walked through it, then they changed it to what it is, what you see here. So there's a couple of funny things. Yeah.
Well, it certainly is indicative of the book. And how long have you been in Spokane?
We moved here in 2016.
You were in 2016.
2 years. Yeah.
Okay. And where were you originally then?
We lived just north of Seattle. proper.
So when you were doing most of your world travel, probably out of Seattle.
It was all out of Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you'd indicated that your grandparents had come to the United States in 1910, I believe, from Austria. Is that correct?
That's correct. So
were they in the Northwest or otherwise?
They actually started out in Nebraska, and my grandfather's brother ended up in Chewelah, Washington, just north. And I'm not sure how he got there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Just know he ended up there.
But then my grandfather followed him, and they ended up there, and that's where my dad was born, and that's where I was born, and there's a whole bunch of Reiners in North Stevens County still. So,
well, let's take a short little break and come right back, because I'd actually like to jump in and at least talk to the extent that you'd like to talk about some of the characters, some of the reasoning potentially behind David and Becky, which are the main characters, along with their family. We'll come right back after a small break.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm weather forecaster and assignment anchor at Spokane Talks Online, Colin Pittman, and I am honored to be the host of the new program, Spokane's Youth Spotlight, brought to you by Spokane Talks Online and the Spokesman Review, where we are interviewing and getting to know outstanding youth in our community each month. If you'd like to nominate someone in our community that you think should be recognized, that is doing something great here in the region or has an amazing story, visit SpokaneTalksOnline.com or Spokesman.com and look under Youth Spotlight to nominate. And be sure to tune in each month as we find the best in the Inland Northwest.
To find the right home for you, you'll work with your realtor to compare the properties you're interested in, analyze the market, and figure out a reasonable offer price. And now, here you are, ready to make an offer. Yay, you! Here's how it works. First, you'll complete an offer sheet which your realtor will then present to the owner. Sometimes, a nice note to the owner can help your offer stand out. Butter them up. Tell them how much you love their garden, that it reminds you of gardening with your grandmother as a child. Do not mention you're going to bulldoze it and put in a pool. The owner may accept the offer, reject it, or counter. It's important to be in close contact with your realtor during the negotiation process so any changes can be reviewed. Your realtor is like your consigliere, and that makes you the Don. Once your offer is finally accepted, there are usually some contingencies that must be met in order to keep the contract alive. Inspections are totally common in real estate transactions. They include termite checks, surveys to determine boundaries, appraisals to determine value for lenders, title reviews, and structural inspections. This stuff is mind-numbingly fascinating. But you know what's even more fascinating? Actually getting your new house.
To help you be safe, Washington state law requires you to call 811 2 full business days before you plan, for example, to dig, drill, plow, pull from, or pound anything into the ground. Be prepared to provide the operator with the correct address, cross street, and the description of your work. You must mark the dig area with white paint. The operator will inform you of the utilities notified of your impending excavation. Wait for all their marks. Be safe and dig with care.
Welcome back to Business Talks. Ryan McNeice here in the studio talking to Warren Reiner, Bel Air Man, and we were talking about the impetus of how this book came about, your history in business, many decades career in a different industry. But I think what's fascinating to me and interesting is the passion, the critical eye, the business skills, etc., that you've put towards figuring out how to bring this book to the market, whether it be through Mill City Press and the certain challenges that come from self-publishing. You looked at traditional publishing, but ended up looking at the avenue of self-publishing. Let's talk about the characters. The main characters are Dave and Becky in a small-town Idaho environment. How did you even start there? We won't necessarily get into what the plot lines are a little bit, as much as you'd like to, but we've got to leave a little bit for the reader. Where did the story come from?
So David is definitely a big part of my own background. It takes place in the early 1960s. It's a little before my time, but I like the early 1960s with, there was a lot of energy around the space program. Jack Kennedy was very energizing at the time, a lot of hope for the future, as opposed to the late 60s were very tumultuous. The early 60s were very different. And I remember that. I was very young. I mean, I was a lot younger than David is portrayed in the book, but I remember that time frame, and it was a very inspiring time to be alive.
Made an indelible mark.
Yeah, and the small town is similar to my own. I mean, I grew up in a small town in eastern Washington. I grew up on a small farm.
Yeah, so
and so David's character is a farm.
But don't they say with writers, to a certain extent, write what you know?
Sure, absolutely.
And that might not be specific, but you do have to have something to draw from, and I think that's what you're explaining.
Right, it's kind of interesting. Little details, like if a reader is reading any kind of story, even fiction, and they realize that certain storylines are not credible, I mean, you lose them.
Right.
I mean, they realize right away that, gosh, that isn't really correct.
Well, and a couple pieces I think that resonates for me is on a small farm. I don't have that background, but reading it, you talk about milking cows and farm life. I think somebody that does know would pick right up if it's something potentially that I'm writing, because I don't know enough about it, would be unauthentic. And I think that's something that comes across in this, that you are drawing on your life experience.
Well, and to that point, Ryan, because of Facebook, you have a lot of people from your past, right, that come back into your life, and the book has done that in a large way. And people who knew me, most of them worked on farms back in those days, because there were a lot of small farms as opposed to agribusiness today.
Right, different level.
Different, and they recognized the events and the work, the chores, and freezing water in the wintertime.
It was literally part of their upbringing, the fabric.
Exactly.
And so, David, you're drawing on that to a certain extent from some of your early imagery and experiences. What about Becky?
So Becky was probably a little bit like a steady girl I had in high school. Their relationship was innocent, like it would have been in the 1960s, I think, different than today. Well, a little bit different than today. We weren't exposed to things that kids are today. So I think that's got a little bit of appeal to a certain audience, certainly an older audience. Nostalgic appeal to it. And in the book, David is a Catholic. His family is devout Catholic, as mine was growing up, and Becky is not. So they have their own little conflict.
They're coming to this
going
issue
together
from a different angle.
So it's meant to be an inspirational book. It's, if you look on Amazon, it's listed as a Christian book, which I guess the back theme is there. But I really wrote it more around being inspiring. Life affirming, because the lesson of it isn't really tied to a particular faith.
Warren, I actually would agree with that, rather than, everybody wants to always categorize, whether it be a book or music or what have you, depending on the genre. But my read of it would agree with what you're saying, that it doesn't necessarily have to be in that particular category. I mean, that's appropriate, but it is more based on the aspirations of these young kids in the community. What can we speak to in terms of, what are people looking at with this book? What are they going to see? Again, we don't want to kind of give it away, but what can you speak to in that regard?
Well, I think it speaks to a little bit of looking at the decisions and choices you make in your life. And even though these are young people and people at my age, you think, well, I've kind of made all the ones I'm going to make, but that's never true, right? You can always make good decisions and better decisions, and so they make choices in the book, and it's around a Christmas theme in the book, although it isn't, I would say, a traditional recipe of a Christmas story. Because the David and Becky actually, I don't want to give away too much here, but they don't end up in the happy union that a Hallmark Christmas movie would be.
I would actually, I think it lends credibility to the overall storyline. Again, we won't take away the ending from individuals. But I think, as you're saying, it takes its time to weave through why somebody makes a decision. If they do, what are the cost-benefit analysis of those decisions,
Right.
good, bad, or indifferent. But I think through both their lives and even the families' lives, that how that's interjected into why they maybe made the decisions they
Right.
made.
And their individual faiths aren't really an issue in the end. It really didn't matter.
No, I think my interpretation would be it's who they are as people,
Right.
rather
Right.
than specific.
So those
religious.
values, I think, were universal,
Mhm.
right? They're good human traits and
Well,
characteristics.
the way I would interpret it is the human desire to find a purpose, find a path, and if you think you're on a purpose or path, what's the reason? And then,
Right.
is it even the right? Is it the right reason? And then maybe the conviction to follow that.
Right.
I
Right.
think that's throughout the book as well.
Right. In the end, that's kind of where it goes, and
Mhm.
the conviction becomes stronger than some of the human emotions
Right.
that are tied in.
I think in the end, or in the ending, again, without giving it away, that actual, just as you described that maybe these convictions outweigh surface
Right.
materialism
Right.
and/or emotions. What is, because it's self-published, and you mentioned Amazon earlier, what is the best way for folks to find this and check out Bel Air Man?
So locally,
That's good, though.
Auntie's has it in stock. Both Barnes & Nobles should have it in stock. Also, if you're in the Coeur d'Alene area, the Well-Read Moose has it in
Actually,
stock.
really like
That's a
really
great
like
little
that
store.
place.
Yeah.
And you recently did a book signing, I believe, and probably have done multiple. Have you done book signings at each of those
I
respective
have.
places?
Yes. Yeah. So I've done book signings at each, and I've done a couple of signings on the west side, near where I used to live. So I could. Most bookstores want to make sure that you'll have a draw, at least locally. So if they want to take the time to put you up, so I went to places that I knew where I draw in people that I knew.
Right. Draw on
so
those.
So it
the
worked out
core
pretty
of your-
well.
And whether we're talking to a musician, a business person that's either sold a business, an actor, what's the question everybody always asks? What's next? What do you do next? But in this particular case, you put a lot of effort, passion, time into Bel Air Man. I believe you've indicated you are finishing up another book.
I am. So I started another book. It's a little different genre. So this book is more of a mystery. It's more of a whodunit. And for this book, I used my background in high technology as sort of the background for the book. It's a So the book lead-in is a suicide happens, or an apparent suicide happens to their brilliant software developer in the secret lab of the company.
Well, that resonates. It's certainly an issue right now in our society.
Exactly, right. So, but the police report is, they report, and the AMA's report is a suicide, but his close colleague and the protagonist of the story feels that some of the evidence was overlooked, and so he's
more to the story, so to speak.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he starts on a quest to uncover what the truth is, and the story follows him. And instead of using, let's say, traditional police methods, he uses his high-tech tools that he's used to in his business to try and uncover the truth. And it takes him down a path where he almost ends up like his colleagues. So
Okay. I'm interested.
it should be a fun read.
And what do you think, time to market, so to speak? Are you going to self-publish that as well?
I'm actually trying to pitch an agent with
Okay.
it. I'll see how that goes. If it turns out to be too lengthy, then I'll probably go back to self-publishing.
That would be something I'd be encouraged to have you back at the table discussing again, because then you'd be able to kind of weigh the thorough experiences of self-publishing, traditional publishing, yay, nay,
Right.
good, bad, what are the challenges or advantages. And when did you say that most likely would be able to be read by the public?
I'm guessing near the end of this year.
Okay.
By the time we get through all the editing, so I'm still finishing up the first draft manuscript, and editing usually takes it's 90 to 120 days. You
I
have to
would
go
think.
through 3 or 4 rounds with the editor.
And are you writing and editing, or at least you're writing? Are you doing that at home, maybe from a home office, or?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
So I do. You actually use the Stephen King method, which he wrote a great book. I don't know if you're familiar with it, called On Writing.
Yep, I
and
am.
it's a great tool. I mean, if anyone's wanting to write, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I've
he's
heard that several
very
times.
practical. And he said, just write.
Just
You know,
write.
Don't worry
There's no
about
special
editing.
tricks.
Yeah.
Just write.
So that's what I'm doing. I just write, and then I go back and edit, and actually do a lot of rewriting in the process.
Well,
because-
everybody has their process.
That's right. So it's more, I'm not doing editing now, but once I finish the first manuscript, then I go back through and do my own editing. Then I get a professional editor to go through.
Well, Warren, so many pieces to this puzzle. It's exciting to see someone like yourself that's taken a real professional background and converted that knowledge, that base, into a passion of writing not only this novel, but the one that has a working title, so we won't throw it out quite yet, but sounds like a great kind of mystery thriller. And we'll have you come back again, but I appreciate your time here on Business Talks.
Great. Thank you,
so
Ryan.
much.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
See you next time.
Business Talks is produced in Spokane, Washington by SpokaneTalksOnline.com, which is solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, and hear this program again online anytime at SpokaneTalksOnline.com. Business Talks is brought to you by our friends at STCU and Well Dressed Walrus. Business Talks wishes you good business and a good day.